talk more about that story. Bring in energy expert Mohamed Madhi. Mohamed, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time today. So this Karpowership potential deal with the South African government, is it worth all the trouble?
So good afternoon, Tembekile, and good afternoon to viewers. Absolutely not. So I have to agree with the previous speaker who spoke about this. There's no doubt that it is not the cheapest alternative. It is not the quickest alternative that has been proven over the last 2.5 years, and it's not in the interests of the country. What we could have done, with many different forms of generation capacity, many different alternatives to Karpowership, would have taken this country a lot further than it is right now, and would have also stimulated different parts of the industry on a more sustainable and long-term basis. So absolutely don't see any rationale for the Karpowership approach.
And if that is the case, because you're the second guest we've had on the program today who says it's not the cheapest, it's not the best deal that we should be pursuing as a country, why is there such an insistence to go through with it? Because as things stand, even the Environmental Affairs Department, which had been quite skeptical at the beginning, has already granted some approvals, giving the green light for it to potentially succeed.
So look, I don't think all the approvals have been granted from the environmental. You're right, some of them have been granted. And just as on a technicality, you can't actually achieve financial flows until you have all of the approvals in place. But coming back to your question, there's clearly a host of, I would say, interested parties that are very, very invested into this project. And I think it's up to the media and various other bodies to investigate this in a lot more detail. And where we cannot investigate it further, we need to agitate for formal investigation into this. There's no doubt that there is no clear rationale to undertake the Karpowership initiative.
Let's talk about the issue of financial close, because it's come up again repeatedly in this conversation. What level of scrutiny do you expect the arrangement to face at that level, given that the environmentalists in particular are not giving up on their fight to block this deal, which they say would do so much harm to marine life and the oceans?
Which I think is true. It undoubtedly is not great for the environment. In fact, it's very bad for the environment. Look, the environmentalists, would have to put forward a case that says the environmental process has not either not been followed properly or not been completed properly. And that level of detail will have to be scrutinized, but it would be the financial institutions that will make a call together with NERSA. So financial institutions will make a call on how comfortable they are with releasing funding for the project and, starting giving the green light for that project to proceed. And of course, NERSA ultimately has to provide an acceptance of what is going to be built. So although NERSA doesn't have to approve this, it certainly needs to register it. And in its registration process, it asks for various questions. And, various requirements also still need to be met. I think the registration process in NERSA is a whole different question, but safe to say that it would not qualify as being properly registered if all of those boxes were not ticked. But most importantly, we need more transparency around the entire process. But, that's the difficult route. Let's look at some basic questions. We need to ask, why, with the dealers that have been put in place, we are still pursuing an option which is no longer the quickest option? And secondly, the second major rationale for this was, for the time frame in which it was going to provide power, it was going to be one of the cheaper options. Well, we know with subsequent revelations and subsequent issues with NERSA, etc., that the actual tariff is going to be very high. Pretty high. So those two fundamental reasons for going with this now have fallen away. So there can be no clear rationale for continuing with this.
So is there enough in the mix currently in terms of renewables and the other interventions that government and Eskom are looking to introduce to keep the lights on? Is there enough from those streams to make it absolutely unnecessary to pursue something at the level of Karpowership? I think over 1,200 megawatts of power is what Karpowerships would generate or have to supply under the deal.
So there are certainly a host of alternatives that are cheaper than Karpowership. that can provide baseload power. And one of the most obvious of those would have been kickstarting the local natural gas industry through a proper importation process. That process was started several years ago, but never given the required impetus, and it never reached critical mass. So instead of having a Karpowership initiative, we could have had a much more structured, a much more well thought out approach to a gas to power initiative that would have also lent itself to promoting some of the local industry and leaving a more permanent and sustainable economic benefit for the country. So that's one option. But I think the other thing is, if you now look at the time frames, 2.5 years later, where we're sitting, battery energy storage, solar and wind provide a great degree of grid independence. Admittedly, not 100% yet, but very close to that. And in the time frame, the remaining time frame, it will take Karpowership to come on stream. At that point, it would be more feasible to have a combination of solar, wind, and battery energy storage, enough to overcome those 4 or 5 days of cloud cover that we have several times in the year and still be able to produce power. So, through alternative sources during those times. So there are clearly more expensive, more eco-friendly, and much smarter options available than Karpowership.
What does it mean then, this deal potentially, and the insistence on pursuing it, for the clarity, coherence of government's not just commitment to keeping the lights on, but also the climate commitments that it's also made when it comes to just what we've seen this week, the end of the COP28 summit?
Look, it's certainly negative in all of those respects, but let me point out something that has been probably missed, and the effect, the consequence of Karpowership. What it means is now Eskom is going to be paying a fairly high rate, in fact a very high rate. So Eskom's overall average tariff will increase, proportionately to the amount of power being produced by Karpowership and the tariff they have to pay for that. All this goes to make Eskom more uncompetitive in the long term. And the more uncompetitive Eskom is, the easier it is for independence and for other sources of energy to come to the fore. So private sector and those that are able to build on-site power plants are simply going to not use Eskom any longer and will continue to build these on-site power plants at tariffs that are cheaper than what Eskom is. So tying Eskom down to these kinds of high tariffs makes no sense. It makes Eskom more unsustainable in the long term. Eskom needs to start looking at generation assets that provide power at much cheaper tariffs than its average power at the moment, of its average cost of power, as opposed to going to generation assets that provide power at a higher cost than its average cost of power. So this is fundamentally a flaw in the long-term sort of effect on Eskom.
Just in terms of feasibility, this is not going to come cheap. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Mohamed, about, for example, a tariff increase. How would, A, the country be able to fund this via National Treasury, and B, what would be the trickle-down effect for you and I as people who rely on the system?
So look, in this particular case, Karpowership would be, building the plant or providing the generation asset rather, and would be recovering its capital outlay through the power tariff that it charges. Now that tariff is fairly high. So what it means for the average person in the street is that Eskom's overall tariff is going to be quite high. So Eskom would need to sustain that by having higher increases year on year. Couple that with the fact that Eskom's market share is eroding and its customer base is shrinking, means that Eskom is going to have a greater difficulty in keeping abreast of the market and being able to be competitive. So this is not good for Eskom's overall health in the long term.
Mohamed Madhi, good to speak to you.